Thank you for joining me today for a new topic in our Wednesday night studies. We're going to be talking for a few weeks, probably 3 to 4 weeks, about the topic of anxiety and worry. Now, as I begin, I'll state the obvious. You notice very quickly that I'm in a new spot tonight, and I've struggled a little bit with the sound here and have decided that for today it's going to have to be okay. I'll see if I can find some help with that over the next couple of weeks. But what you didn't know last week, in the video last week, was that the books on the shelves behind me in the office were the only books on the shelves at all, and only books in the office, as well as many other things that were already taken out. I'm in the process of moving offices. Jake has joined us this week, and he's in what was my office, and I'm going to be in a new spot. So it'll take me a few weeks to get landed in a good spot for these videos. So we'll go as we are for right now. A quote that we're going to probably note a couple of times through this study. One of my favorite statements on anxiety and worry. It's by Corrie ten Boom, a very interesting lady with a wonderful story. She says it this way. She says, "Worrying is carrying tomorrow's load with today's strength. Carrying 2 days at once. It's moving into tomorrow ahead of time." She goes on to say that worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow. It empties today of its strength. Now, when we use the words anxiety, it has a negative connotation. When we use the word worry, it has a negative connotation. To say that someone is a worrier is never a compliment. It always has a negative connotation to it. Yet when we use words like care or a word like concern, well, that has a much more positive feel about it. It just sounds so much better. Now, the interesting thing is that all four of these words, worry, anxiety, care, and concern, are all words that are used in the New Testament to define the word, the Greek word merimna or merimnao, according to how far back in the root you go of that word. But it's the word that in most of our newer translations is translated as anxiety. In a few Bibles as worry. It's easy then for us to conclude that anxiety can be unhealthy and detrimental. But I want to start by establishing that by definition, the word does not carry simply a negative connotation. And we want to illustrate that as we begin our thoughts together this week. Now, apart from the Bible's use of the word or the Greek usage, think with me just more about the way we define, the way our dictionaries would define these words. Anxiety is defined as distress or uneasiness of mind caused by fear, danger, or misfortune. Sometimes it's defined as earnest but tense desire, eagerness. You know, a child is anxious for their birthday to roll around. They're anxious to get a sweet snack. They're anxious for things, and we don't see that as a problem. We just see it as an intense desire. Now, on the other hand, we usually define the word worry, or at least one way that we can define the word worry, is to torment oneself with or suffer from disturbing thoughts, to, some folks would say, to fret. And the difference in terms there between worry and anxiety is, for the most part, a degree of awareness. A degree of awareness. I want you to go with me first, I'll take you first, to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, there's a statement by the Apostle Paul. he's talked about all the difficulties that he's had, and as a matter of fact, he's just finished listing some of the problems that have come his way. And then he makes the statement out of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. He said, "And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches." He says, apart from other things, there is a daily pressure, the concern in some Bibles for all the churches. I think the King James says the care for all the churches. But even as he talks about the difficulties that he's dealt with, he says, and something else that occupies my mind, and we'll get more to that in just a few moments, but something else that is on my mind all the time is the pressure and the anxiety for all the churches. Now, as we know, Paul established most of these churches that we're very familiar with, especially, obviously, in the book of Acts. And we don't read that verse and say, well, now, Paul, you shouldn't worry. Because we realize that his concern over the churches, and as we read the letters to those churches, we understand very quickly that he had good reason to be concerned and that it took constant care. It took constant dealing with issues and dealing with problems. And so I picked that verse out. It's just sort of an aside. It's just one of Paul's statements in a context that's not necessarily on the topic, but it points out the sort of neutrality of the word by definition, because none of us would suggest that Paul should not have the concern that he has for the churches. Now, this particular word, the one that I read the ESV most of the time, so the one that I think on every occasion gets translated as anxiety is this Greek word merimna. 4 of the places, or 3 of the places I should say, out of the 6, one verse has a double use of it, so it's 5 separate verses. But 3 of them come from the story, the parable of the soils. And I'll notice the one in Mark chapter 4. You know how the parable goes, that some seed fell here and some seed fell there, and some seed fell on good ground. But of the ones of interest to us in this context, as Jesus, after he tells the parable, as he translates it for them, as he shares the meaning of what he has said. I'm going to jump in verse 18. And others, speaking of the seeds, are the ones sown among the thorns. They are those who hear the word. He's telling you what kind of person that we're talking about here. They are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. You know, in that context, when he says the cares of the world, I think we would, in that sense, think of that use of the word care as being negative, obviously, but as being a distraction. You know, the world throws itself at us and demands our attention. The world is, at the very best, a distraction to us. Now, obviously, as we've implied, the verse we read a couple of moments ago, about 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, where Paul talks about his anxiety for all the churches, that's another use of that word. Now, the third use of that word, or the third context in which this particular word is used, takes us in a little bit different direction. If you might turn there with me, it's 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. The paragraph begins in verse 6 and 7. Let's read that together. Peter writes, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you." And then verse 7, "Casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Now, the King James gave it simply as casting all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Now, for those of you who might be interested, that second use of the word care in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7 is a different word that simply means I care about you. It's a word that strictly means someone's concern, someone's care, the compassion that one might feel. So it's a little different word. But he says, casting our anxieties, our cares on him. The implication there is that we have things that are intense concerns for us. We have things that are worries or are anxieties. And Peter is simply saying, cast those on your Lord. Bring those to the feet of your God in prayer. And the implication, at least in this verse, is not that you should not be concerned about all of those things necessarily. Not that all of those things aren't things that should be brought, because he says, bring them to the Father, and in a sense, bring them to the Father in prayer. But we do leave that verse with the impression that those are not things that we should be handling alone. We should not be bearing those things by ourselves. That God offers to help and that he will help. Now, on this particular word that we're talking about today, there's another interesting thing about this word. And that is that it is a compound word. It is a word made up of two words. In the English pronunciation of the Greek word, it's merimna or merimnao. And you think about that, the M and the N together, it sort of sounds like it's two words simply put together, and it is. The word merizo is the word divide. Making a distinction, making a separation. And then the word nao or nos is the word mind. Now, the beauty in that, and the reason why we are advantaged oftentimes to not just take a word in Scripture and go to our dictionary to define it, but go to a Greek dictionary in this sense, or go to the original language to define that word. Because it'll give us the nuances of that word that sometimes will be very helpful. And so my point of that is that the word for anxiety here is literally translated a divided mind. That's intriguing. Anxiety splits our energy. Worry splits our mind. Oftentimes, when we're worried about something, someone will notice that we are distracted, that we're not present, that we're not in the moment. And they'll ask us, what's the problem? Are you worried about something? What are you concerned about? You're obviously somewhere else. Because you're not in the present, or at least you're partly in the present, and you're partly wherever that concern has you. And I find it interesting that the word itself that we see in the Bible as anxiety literally means a divided mind. Paul is clearly implying in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, our first verse, that there are other things on his mind, other than the things he's already listed. There are other things on his mind. So we understand that's simply a reality in this topic. And then in the parable of the soils, because the word is found there both in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three synoptic gospels, he's also talking about the distraction of the world. You know, we have what is our intent and our heart and what we want to be thinking on, pondering on, and having our mind. And then there are the things that distract us from that. And so those distractions are, in a sense, dividing our mind. Now, as we continue in this topic, we're going to talk next week about a little different word, but it's translated as being anxious in most of our Bibles. In the ESV, it's consistently translated as being anxious. We'll look at passages like the one you might have thought I was getting to today, and that's Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Or your mind may also have gone to the 5 times that the word anxious is used in the last few verses of Matthew chapter 6. Where he talked there that the birds don't worry about these things, and you should not be anxious about these things as well. But that'll be our discussion next week. And then the third and maybe possibly even the fourth week, we'll talk about, as we've sort of defined everything out and looked at several verses, then we'll talk about what we do and what we maybe should do about the anxieties and the worries that burden our hearts. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you joining us for these Wednesday night studies, and I hope that you enjoy this study. Thank you so much for your kind thoughts and words about our recent study on faith. Many of you have suggested that you enjoyed that study, and the reality was I enjoyed going through that study. I enjoyed the work of that study as well. So thank you for watching, and thank you for your interest in these matters. And we'll continue next week in our journey talking about dealing with anxiety and worry. Thank you again for being with us. I'll hope to see you on Sunday.